Hello everyone and welcome to another session of AP Human Geography with Mr. Elrod. Today we're going to continue on in Unit 5 discussing agriculture and rural land use. In our last video we wrapped up the different types of subsistence agriculture, and today we're going to move on and discuss commercial agriculture. Not really comparing and contrasting the two, but just looking at commercial agriculture, and then hopefully based on the previous video you can do some comparison and some contrasting yourself. Hopefully you're able to do some of that. Now again, the main difference between commercial agriculture and subsistence agriculture is really the purpose for the agriculture. What is the purpose for the crops that you're raising? And so when we talk about commercial agriculture, again, one of the main elements of it is that it is a commercial practice that is for profit. You are a farmer looking to grow crops in order to sell them at market. Now, some other characteristics that make it a little bit different from subsistence agriculture is that it tends to be on a much larger scale. Because you're trying to make profit, you do things on a larger scale so you can sell in large quantities. We tend to find it in more developed countries, and it tends to be much more capital intensive instead of labor intensive. And again, all of this is kind of indicative of a more developed country, more industrialized forms of work, and in this case agriculture, and as a result it's going to be much more expensive. Now, the different types of agricultural practices we're going to talk about in commercial agriculture, and I forgot to put one on here, so if I had it in order of the types of agricultural practices I'm going to talk about, I would put it right here, right after Mediterranean. So we're going to talk about Mediterranean plantation agriculture. That'll be right after it. We're going to do both of those in this video. Then we'll go on to mixed crop and livestock, dairying, ranching, and then large-scale grain agriculture. But again, in this video, we're going to talk specifically about Mediterranean agriculture and plantation agriculture. And the reason we're going to do that is because both Mediterranean agriculture and plantation agriculture don't necessarily fit the mold of the other forms of commercial agriculture. When we talk about Mediterranean agriculture is one of the types of agriculture that is not necessarily found in just more developed countries. You actually find Mediterranean agriculture in more developed as well as less developed countries. I'm not sure if I said cultures, I'm not really sure what I said. But anyway, so you find it in both more developed and less developed countries. Mediterranean agriculture has more to do with the climatic region that the agriculture is practiced in, as opposed to the actual physical location where it is and the types of crops that are being grown. So again, it pertains primarily to the climatic region. When we talk about the Mediterranean region, the Mediterranean agriculture, we're not just talking about the specific Mediterranean region that is on the Mediterranean Sea in southern Europe, northern Africa, and parts of Southwest Asia. We're talking about several parts of the world that have very similar climatic as well as topographical features. So we find it in places like California, parts of Chile. That's going to be South Africa, as well as southern Australia, as well as in parts of southern Australia. Interestingly enough, it is starting to be winter time here in Georgia, and we just started getting a lot of our fruits from South America. My wife just bought a pack of blueberries the other day, product of Chile. So something to think about in terms of globalization, access to goods during different times of the year, agriculture, all those fun things. So Mediterranean climates are characterized by hot, dry summers with mild and wet winters. And in this type of agricultural region, you'll see it in the picture down here, it tends to be a hilly region with some flat-lying areas, as well as typically relatively thin, rockier soil, which is why you get some of the different types of crops that you have being grown, especially things like olives, especially things like grapes. But some other crops that are characteristic of Mediterranean agriculture, things like barley and wheat, as well as the raising of sheep and goats. Now, one of the things that students have a hard time a lot of times understanding is that really sheep and goats have historically been some of the more popular animals to raise, especially in less developed countries, because sheep and goats, they're smaller, they don't take up as much room, they're not going to consume as much water, they're not going to consume as much grass, and so you tend to find sheep and goats really all over the place. Plus, goats produce hair that can be used for a variety of different cloths and making tents and things like that, and then sheep, of course, for their wool. And so that's where that's the type of production we tend to find in those parts of the world. The other type of agriculture we're going to look at here is plantation farming or plantation agriculture. Now, again, plantation agriculture would be considered a form of commercial agriculture, but plantation agriculture is almost strictly found in less developed countries. Now, you can probably find some pockets of plantation agriculture in more developed countries, but it's not going to be the norm. In fact, there's a very large tea plantation just right outside of Charleston, South Carolina. Typically, though, because of the price or the cost of agricultural production in the United States, you wouldn't find those types of agricultural practices in more developed countries. Another term for plantation agriculture is agricultural estates, and so some of the characteristics of those are obviously very large land areas that are devoted primarily to the growing of one or two crops that are in very high demand. And those top crops are typically referred to as cash crops. Now, this definition isn't going to be exact, and it's not going to be great for all of the crops that are grown on plantations. But a lot of times, I like to refer to cash crops as crops that are not grown for immediate human consumption, and they're definitely not essentials. They're definitely going to be luxury items. And what I mean by not for immediate human consumption, for the most part, when we look at plantation agriculture and cash crops, they're crops that have to be processed in some kind of way, whether it's dried coffee beans or cocoa beans, or whether we're talking about tea leaves, as we see in the picture here, that are being grown and produced and things like that, or cotton that has to be processed, or indigo that has to be processed. Typically, cash crops have to undergo some sort of processing before they can be made really into usable items for human consumption. And again, most of the time, they're going to be luxury items and things that are not necessarily essential. And I guess sugar is another great example of a plantation agricultural crop. And again, very similar to the other forms of commercial agriculture, it's the money is going to be made from high volume sales, and so you have to grow a lot of it, and you have to grow large quantities of it, sell large quantities of it in order to make a profit from that, so that you can keep your business going. When we look at plantations, it was really the Europeans who established the first plantations during their periods of colonization and imperialism. They established the plantations and colonies almost in those particular instances, it was almost strictly to produce luxury items specifically for the European country. Certainly, the people living in the colonies and the people working on the plantations couldn't afford the items being produced on the plantation. In fact, some of the focus today on cash crop production is on how people in those parts of the world still can't afford the items from the plants that they grow. I think there have been some movies made on especially chocolate. I think is one of the big ones that people focus on. And again, so some of the examples of that: coffee, tea, cotton, sugar would be another example. And one of the reasons that the Europeans developed these colonies and used these plantations on these colonies is primarily because the climate in the European countries is not hospitable at all. It's a temperate climate, not very good for growing these types of crops that they were looking for. And so they needed these areas that had the more tropical, humid subtropical climate, so that they could grow these cash crops that they were looking for. And so where do we tend to find the plantation agriculture? We tend to find it in mild to tropical countries, countries with mild to tropical climates. So geographically, we're looking at mostly along the coast of Africa, parts of Latin America, as well as Asia. And again, you see plantations typically along the coast, and the reason for that is about transportation costs. You want your plantation near the coast or near a waterway, maybe a canal where boats can come up a little bit further inland, so the goods can be transported directly onto the ship and they can be sent back out to sea, for ease of transport and also for reduction in cost in transport. And we look at plantation agriculture, and this is one of the I guess maybe complaints that people have, aside from things like low wages, the difficult task, and a lot of times not necessarily unsafe working conditions, but certainly working conditions that are arduous, being out in humid areas, standing in lots of water, which can create infections, being in mosquito-infested areas and things like that, is that these plantations are owned by overseas corporations. Most of the time, those corporations are based out of more developed countries, and so the complaint is that the overseas corporations are exploiting the people, they're exploiting the land. The people in the country don't necessarily get all the benefits of the company, especially like taxes and things from having the high-paying jobs in those countries. And so it's essentially this idea that the overseas corporations are using the less developed countries and their labor to profit from that. So that's all that we're going to talk about today. Again, we discussed commercial agriculture, plantation agriculture, as well as Mediterranean agriculture. Feel free to comment in the comment box below if you have any questions or would like to leave a comment. But I hope to see you next time.